Hey there, tonight we're diving into something that'll make your worst Monday morning feel like a spa day. We are exploring how justice worked in Korea's Joseon Dynasty, and you probably won't sleep soundly for the next week once you hear what passed for law and order back then. So now, kill the overhead lights, maybe light a candle, and let's get into some history. It is 1392, and Korea has just established what would become one of the longest-lasting dynasties in human history. The Joseon kingdom stretches before you like a vast tapestry of rice paddies, mountain fortresses, and bustling market towns. But beneath this serene surface lies a justice system that would make modern prosecutors weep with envy or horror. The Joseon approach to punishment wasn't born in a vacuum. It emerged from centuries of Confucian philosophy, filtering down from China, mixed with distinctly Korean sensibilities about hierarchy, family honor, and social harmony. But here's where it gets interesting. Unlike the purely retributive justice we might expect from a medieval society, Joseon punishment was designed around the radical idea that criminals could be morally reformed. Think of it as the world's first, and arguably most brutal, rehabilitation program. The philosophical foundation rested on the Confucian principle that humans are inherently good, but can be corrupted by poor influences, bad education, or weak moral fiber. Punishment, therefore, wasn't just about making someone suffer for their crimes. It was about shocking them back into righteousness. It was spiritual surgery performed with bamboo canes and public humiliation. This reformative approach created some fascinating contradictions. On one hand, Joseon law was remarkably sophisticated, with detailed legal codes that specified exactly how many strokes of the cane different crimes deserved. On the other hand, the system was shot through with exceptions, bribes, and social hierarchies that could turn a death sentence into a slap on the wrist, or vice versa. The legal framework itself was borrowed heavily from Chinese Tang and Ming Dynasty codes, but the Koreans weren't content to simply copy and paste. They adapted these laws to fit their own social structure, which was even more rigidly hierarchical than China's. In Joseon Korea, your punishment wasn't just determined by what you did. It was determined by who you were, who you knew, and how much rice your family could afford to donate to the local magistrate's retirement fund. The king sat at the apex of the system, theoretically responsible for the moral well-being of every soul in his kingdom. This wasn't just political rhetoric. It was a genuine belief that the ruler's virtue directly influenced the behavior of his subjects. When crimes increased, it was often seen as a sign that the king needed to examine his own moral failings. It was the ultimate in personal responsibility, with cosmic implications. Below the king, a complex hierarchy of officials administered justice with varying degrees of competence and corruption. County magistrates held enormous power over the daily lives of ordinary people, while higher courts in the capital dealt with serious crimes and appeals from the wealthy or well-connected. The system was designed to be fair and impartial, but like most human institutions, it was riddled with opportunities for those with money and influence to game the system. What made Joseon punishment unique wasn't just its philosophical underpinnings. It was the way these ideas played out in practice. Take the concept of collective responsibility, for instance. If you committed a crime, your entire family could face punishment. Your neighbors might be questioned. Your village could be fined. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a systematic attempt to weave social control into the very fabric of community life. The reformative ideal also meant that punishments were often designed to be educational. Public beatings weren't just about inflicting pain. They were about teaching lessons to both the criminal and the watching crowd. The stocks weren't just uncomfortable. They were positioned in busy marketplaces where maximum numbers of people could observe the consequences of bad behavior. Every punishment was a sermon, every sentence a moral lesson. But here's where the medieval mind reveals its particular genius for creative suffering. If punishment was meant to reform character, then it had to address the specific moral failing that led to the crime. Thieves faced punishments designed to teach respect for property. Adulterers faced shame-based punishments that emphasized family values. Tax evaders, well, let's just say the Joseon tax collectors had some very inventive ideas about financial education. This philosophical foundation would shape every aspect of how justice worked in Joseon Korea, from the grandest political trials to the most petty village disputes. It created a system that was simultaneously more humane and more terrifying than simple revenge-based justice, because it claimed to be improving your soul while it destroyed your body. Now that we've established the philosophical underpinnings of Joseon justice, that charming blend of moral improvement and systematic terror, let's examine the actual machinery of punishment. The Joseon dynasty didn't just wing it when it came to discipline. They created a beautifully organized hierarchy of suffering known as the 5 punishments, borrowed from Chinese legal tradition, but refined with distinctly Korean attention to detail. Think of it as a medieval ladder of escalating unpleasantness, where each rung represented a more serious crime and a correspondingly more creative form of correction. The beauty of this system lay in its apparent logic. There was a punishment for every crime, and theoretically, every punishment fit the crime. Of course, the reality was messier, but we'll get to that delicious complexity later. At the bottom of this ladder sat Kai, the light beating. Now, when I say light, I'm using the term relatively. These weren't gentle love taps from a concerned parent. We're talking about 10 to 50 strokes with a thin bamboo cane applied to the buttocks and thighs of the offender. The cane itself was precisely regulated, exactly 2 feet long, with specific thickness requirements that would make modern quality control specialists weep with jealousy. Too thick, and you might cause permanent damage. Too thin, and the punishment would lack proper educational value. The crimes that earned you a date with the thin cane were relatively minor infractions: petty theft, minor assault, public drunkenness, or failing to show proper respect to your elders. The interesting part was the ceremony surrounding even these light beatings. They weren't quick affairs administered in some dark corner. Oh no, these required witnesses, proper forms, and careful documentation. Even your lightest brush with Joseon justice came with paperwork. Moving up our ladder of legal unpleasantness, we encountered Jang, the heavy beating. This involved 50 to 100 strokes with a thicker bamboo rod. And here's where things started to get genuinely unpleasant. The thick cane could break skin, cause serious bruising, and leave permanent scars. Crimes worthy of heavy beating included serious theft, assault with injury, adultery, depending on your social status, naturally, and various forms of fraud or deception. What's fascinating about the heavy beating is how it revealed the Joseon obsession with precision in punishment. Court records show meticulous attention to details like the exact angle of the strikes, the interval between blows, and the physical condition of the person being beat. There were rules about stopping if the prisoner fainted, guidelines for medical examination afterward, and specific procedures for recording any permanent damage caused. The third rung brought us to penal servitude, which sounds almost pleasant compared to what we've discussed so far. Don't be fooled. Penal servitude in Joseon, Korea meant years of forced labor, often in remote frontier regions where the work was backbreaking and the living conditions were somewhere between miserable and lethal. Terms ranged from 1 to 3 years, and the work could involve everything from building fortifications to mining operations to agricultural labor in the kingdom's least hospitable regions. What made penal servitude particularly cruel was its social dimension. Remember that Confucian emphasis on family and community ties. Well, being sentenced to years of forced labor effectively severed those connections. Your family faced shame, your business collapsed, and your social network moved on without you. By the time you returned, if you returned, you were essentially starting life over as a social ghost. The fourth punishment escalated dramatically: or exile. This wasn't just being sent away from home. It was systematic erasure from civilized society. Exile came in degrees, from relatively mild banishment to a distant province, all the way up to permanent exile to islands off Korea's coast, where survival itself became a daily challenge. The islands were harsh, isolated, and often populated mainly by other exiles, creating little communities of the legally dead. Exile was reserved for serious crimes, major theft, certain types of assault, corruption by government officials, and various moral offenses that threatened social stability. What made exile particularly terrifying was its indefinite nature. Unlike other punishments that had clear endpoints, exile could last for years or even decades, depending on the whims of subsequent administrations and the political climate. Finally, at the top of our morbid ladder sat saw death. But even death in Joseon, Korea came with options, because apparently medieval Koreans believed in customer service even when it came to execution. There was strangulation, considered the most humane option, and typically reserved for nobles or those whose crimes didn't completely disgrace their families. Then there was beheading, the standard execution method for serious criminals, and for the worst offenders, traitors, parricides, and those whose crimes shocked even medieval sensibilities. There were more elaborate and public forms of execution designed to serve as maximum deterrence. The genius of the 5 punishment system was its flexibility within structure. Local magistrates had some discretion in applying these punishments, taking into account factors like the criminal's age, social status, prior record, and even the economic impact their punishment might have on their family. A wealthy merchant might face exile, while a poor farmer faced penal servitude for the same crime, not because the system was necessarily corrupt, though it often was, but because the punishment was supposed to be reformative, and different people required different forms of reformation. This systematic approach to justice created a society where everyone understood exactly what various crimes would cost them. It was brutal, but it was predictable brutality, which in its own way provided a kind of social stability that pure arbitrary violence never could. Those neatly organized punishments we just discussed didn't materialize out of thin air. They required a process, and what a process it was. The Joseon courtroom was part legal proceeding, part psychological warfare, and part theatrical performance, all wrapped up in a system designed to extract confessions from people who may or may not have actually committed the crimes they were accused of. Walking into a Joseon courthouse was like entering a carefully choreographed nightmare. The magistrate sat elevated on a platform, surrounded by the symbols of his authority, official seals, law books, and most importantly, the instruments of interrogation displayed prominently for all to see. This wasn't subtle. The message was clear. You could cooperate, or things would get very unpleasant very quickly. The physical layout itself was designed to intimidate. Defendants knelt on the floor, and I mean properly knelt, not some casual genuflection. We're talking about the full Korean jial, where you prostrate yourself completely, forehead touching the ground, remaining in that position until given permission to sit up. Try holding that position for a few hours while someone decides your fate, and you'll quickly understand how physical discomfort became part of the psychological pressure. But here's where Joseon justice revealed its particular genius for mental manipulation. The system was absolutely obsessed with confessions. Not just any confession, mind you, but detailed, complete confessions that covered not just what you did, but why you did it, who helped you, and what moral failings led you to your criminal behavior. A simple, yes, I stole the rice, wouldn't suffice. The court wanted your complete spiritual autobiography, delivered with appropriate expressions of remorse and moral awakening. This obsession with confession created some fascinating dynamics. Innocent people sometimes confessed to crimes they didn't commit simply to end the interrogation process. Guilty people sometimes held out for months, enduring increasingly creative forms of persuasion, because they knew that once they confessed, their fate was sealed. And occasionally, people confessed to crimes that were physically impossible for them to have committed, just to make the questioning stop. The interrogation techniques themselves were where things got genuinely creative. The Joseon legal system had developed a sophisticated array of torture devices, each with its own specialized purpose and carefully regulated application. There was the gongpo, a wooden frame that slowly compressed the prisoner's legs between wooden boards. The pressure could be gradually increased over hours or days, creating excruciating pain without causing immediately visible damage. Then there was the juguchi, a delightful contraption that involved suspending the prisoner by their thumbs, while weights were gradually added to their feet. The beauty of this device was its precision. You could increase the suffering incrementally, giving the prisoner plenty of opportunities to reconsider their position on confessing. Court records show meticulous documentation of how much weight was added and when, because even torture required proper paperwork in Joseon, Korea. The water torture was another favorite, though it wasn't the dramatic waterboarding you might imagine. Instead, prisoners were forced to drink enormous quantities of water until their stomachs became painfully distended. Then they were made to lie on their backs, while officials pressed down on their abdomens. It was effective, relatively clean, and left no permanent marks, all important considerations for a legal system that still needed to maintain some pretense of civilization. What made these interrogation sessions particularly nightmarish was their duration. A typical serious criminal case might involve weeks or months of intermittent questioning, with torture sessions carefully spaced to allow for recovery between sessions. The goal wasn't to kill or permanently maim the prisoner. It was to break there, while keeping them physically capable of providing useful information. The psychological warfare extended beyond physical torture. Interrogators were skilled at playing on family relationships, threatening to arrest relatives, or promising leniency for loved ones in exchange for confessions. They would bring in witnesses, sometimes real, sometimes fabricated, to confront the accused with contradictory testimony. They used sleep deprivation, dietary manipulation, and social isolation to wear down resistance. One particularly effective technique involved what we might call confession theater. Prison officials would arrange for the accused to overhear other prisoners confessing to similar crimes, complete with detailed descriptions of their punishments and expressions of gratitude for the court's mercy. These weren't spontaneous conversations. They were carefully scripted performances designed to convince the listener that confession was not only inevitable, but actually beneficial. The role of witnesses in these proceedings was equally theatrical. Joseon law required multiple witnesses for most serious crimes, but the definition of witness was remarkably flexible. Family members could be compelled to testify against each other. Neighbors were expected to report suspicious behavior. Even casual acquaintances could find themselves dragged into court to provide testimony about someone's character or whereabouts. This created a climate of constant surveillance and mutual suspicion. People became careful about their associations, their conversations, and even their facial expressions in public. The knowledge that anyone around you might become a witness in a future legal proceeding shaped social interactions in profound ways. Perhaps most interesting was how the interrogation process reflected broader Joseon values about truth and authority. The system operated on the assumption that truth was singular and discoverable, and that proper authority could extract this truth through the application of sufficient pressure. There was little concept of reasonable doubt or competing narratives. Either you were guilty and would eventually confess, or you were innocent and would be vindicated through your ability to withstand interrogation. This created some genuinely bizarre situations where the process of proving innocence was often more brutal than the punishment for being guilty. Innocent people sometimes died during interrogation, while guilty parties who confessed quickly received relatively lenient sentences. The system incentivized confession regardless of actual guilt, which probably explains why Joseon criminal records are filled with remarkably detailed and psychologically sophisticated confessions that read more like moral philosophy treatises than simple admissions of guilt. Now, those torture devices and confession theaters I just talked through, well, whether you'd actually encounter them depended largely on something you had absolutely no control over: the circumstances of your birth. In Joseon, Korea, justice wasn't blind, it was remarkably keen-sighted when it came to social distinctions, and your position in the rigid class hierarchy could mean the difference between a polite scolding and a very public, very painful death. At the top of this social pyramid sat the Yongbin, the aristocratic class that combined noble birth with scholarly achievement. These were the families that had produced government officials for generations, owned vast estates, and could trace their lineages back to the founding of the dynasty. If you were lucky enough to be born Yongbin, the justice system treated you with a level of courtesy that would make modern defense attorneys weep with envy. When a Yongbin faced criminal charges, the entire process was wrapped in layers of face-saving protocol. They weren't dragged into court in chains. They were politely invited to appear at their convenience. They weren't forced to kneel on hard courtroom floors. Special cushions were provided for their comfort. Most importantly, they weren't subjected to those creative interrogation techniques we discussed earlier. Torture was considered beneath the dignity of the noble class, which must have come as quite a relief to anyone blessed with the right ancestry. This didn't mean Yongbin were above the law entirely. They just lived under a different version of it. When they committed crimes, the punishments were often ingeniously designed to cause maximum shame while minimizing physical suffering. A corrupt Yongbin official might face exile to a remote province, but he'd be allowed to bring servants and maintain a reasonable household. A Yongbin convicted of fraud might have his property confiscated, but his family wouldn't be left destitute. The system even had special provisions for Yongbin who found themselves facing serious criminal charges. There was a delightful legal fiction called voluntary exile, where aristocrats could essentially sentence themselves to leave court and live quietly in the countryside, thus avoiding the embarrassment of a public trial. It was crime and punishment for people who were too important to be seen as criminals. Below the Yongbin sat the Yungin, the middle class of technical specialists, lower-level officials, and skilled professionals. These were people with education and specialized knowledge: interpreters, medical practitioners, astronomers, and the like. They occupied a curious position in the justice system, too important to be treated like common criminals, but not important enough to enjoy full Yongbin privileges. For the Yungin, justice was a more precarious affair. They might avoid the worst physical punishments, but they couldn't count on the elaborate face-saving measures available to the nobility. A Yungin doctor who committed malpractice might face public beating, but it would be administered with a lighter cane and fewer strokes than a commoner would receive for the same offense. It was a middle ground that perfectly reflected their social position better than most, but always aware of how much worse things could get. The vast majority of Korea's population, however, belonged to the Sangmin, commoners, farmers, craftsmen, and merchants, who made up roughly 80% of the population. For these people, justice was a much more straightforward and significantly more painful affair. They faced the full weight of those 5 punishments we discussed earlier, with no cushions, no special considerations, and no face-saving alternatives. When a Sangmin was accused of a crime, They got the complete Joseon justice experience: the kneeling, the interrogation, the torture devices, and whatever punishment the law prescribed, delivered without modification or mercy. A Sangman thief might receive exactly the number of cane strokes specified in the legal code, administered by an official who measured each blow for proper force and accuracy. There was a certain egalitarian brutality to it, at least within the commoner class. Everyone was treated equally badly, but even among commoners, subtle distinctions mattered. Farmers, who were considered the foundation of society in Confucian thinking, sometimes received slightly more lenient treatment than merchants, who were viewed with suspicion for making profit without creating anything of value. A farmer who stole grain to feed his family might face exile, while a merchant who cheated customers might face public execution. As an example to other greedy traders, at the very bottom of this hierarchy sat the Jinmin, the base people, slaves, entertainers, butchers, and others, whose occupations were considered polluting or degrading. For these people, the justice system was particularly harsh and often arbitrary. They could be killed by their masters with minimal legal consequences. When they committed crimes against higher status individuals, the punishments were severe and often involved deliberate humiliation designed to reinforce their low status. What made this system particularly insidious was how it created different standards of evidence for different classes. Testimony from a Yongbin carried enormous weight, while testimony from a Jinmin was often dismissed entirely. A single noble's word could condemn multiple commoners, but it might take dozens of commoner witnesses to challenge a Yongbin's version of events. The system didn't just punish differently based on class. It literally constructed different versions of truth based on who was telling the story. The practical effects of this hierarchical justice were both predictable and absurd. Wealthy families would sometimes arrange marriages or adoptions to elevate the status of family members facing criminal charges. There was a thriving business in fake genealogies that could transform a commoner into a distant Yongbin cousin, at least on paper. Some families bankrupted themselves buying their way into higher social categories, gambling that the legal protections would be worth the cost. Perhaps most tellingly, the system created elaborate workarounds that allowed lower-class individuals to access something resembling fair treatment, but only by acknowledging their inferior status. A commoner could petition for mercy by emphasizing their family's poverty, their children's need for support, or their own ignorance and moral confusion. These petitions were often successful, but they required the petitioner to thoroughly debase themselves and accept their place in the social hierarchy. This class-based justice wasn't seen as corruption or unfairness. It was the natural order of things, as fundamental as the seasons or the phases of the moon. The idea that a slave and a nobleman should face identical punishments for identical crimes would have struck most Joseon-era Koreans as absurd and dangerous. Justice wasn't about equal treatment. It was about maintaining the social harmony that kept civilization functioning, and that harmony required everyone to know their place and accept the consequences that came with it. While social class determined the severity of your punishment in Joseon Korea, gender added another layer of complexity that was both more protective and more restrictive than you might expect. Women in this Confucian society occupied a peculiar position in the justice system. They were simultaneously viewed as morally weaker and therefore less responsible for their actions, and as potentially more dangerous to social order when they transgressed traditional boundaries. The foundation of women's legal status rested on the Confucian principle of Samjang-Jaidu, the three obediences. A woman was expected to obey her father before marriage, her husband during marriage, and her sons in widowhood. This wasn't just social custom. It was legal doctrine that shaped how female criminals were prosecuted, punished, and understood within the broader framework of justice. What this meant in practice was that women were often punished not just for their own crimes, but for the disruption their behavior caused to male authority. A woman who committed adultery wasn't just violating marriage vows. She was challenging the fundamental principle that female sexuality belonged to and was controlled by men. The punishment had to address both the specific act and the broader threat to patriarchal order. The most distinctively gendered punishment was reserved for adultery, and it reveals the Joseon mind's particular genius for combining shame, pain, and social control. Adulterous women faced a punishment called chiljiajayak, the 7 grounds for divorce, but the legal consequences went far beyond simple divorce. A woman convicted of adultery could be beaten, exiled, or in extreme cases, executed, but the punishment often extended to ritual humiliation designed to destroy her social existence entirely. One particularly cruel practice involved forcing the adulterous woman to wear distinctive clothing that marked her shame. She might be required to appear in public with her hair uncovered, a significant violation of social norms, or wearing garments that announced her crime to anyone who saw her. Some regions required adulterous women to carry wooden signs detailing their offenses, turning them into walking advertisements for the consequences of sexual transgression. But here's where things get interesting. The system recognized that women's supposed moral weakness made them easier to lead astray, which sometimes worked in their favor. A woman who committed theft might receive a lighter sentence than a man, on the theory that she was probably influenced by male criminals or driven by desperate circumstances beyond her understanding. This paternalistic mercy came with its own form of degradation. It required women to accept the legal fiction that they were essentially moral children, incapable of full criminal responsibility. Pregnancy offered another fascinating window into gendered justice. Pregnant women couldn't be executed or subjected to severe physical punishment until after giving birth and weaning their children. This sounds humane until you realize it meant women could spend years in prison, enduring deplorable conditions, while their legal fate remained suspended. Some women gave birth in prison and raised their children there until they were old enough to be separated from their mothers, at which point the postponed punishment would finally be carried out. The system also created special categories of female crime that had no male equivalent. There was the crime of excessive jealousy, where a woman could be punished for being too upset about her husband's infidelity or concubines. A wife who made life difficult for her husband's other women could face beating or divorce, regardless of how reasonable her emotions might seem to to modern sensibilities. The message was clear. Female emotions were inherently dangerous and required legal regulation. Women who committed crimes against their in-laws faced particularly severe punishments because these offenses violated the core Confucian principle of filial piety. A daughter-in-law who was disrespectful to her mother-in-law, even verbally, could face exile or severe beating. These weren't crimes of violence or theft. They were crimes of attitude, and they reveal how thoroughly the legal system penetrated into the emotional and psychological lives of women. Perhaps most tellingly, women who killed abusive husbands faced different legal treatment than men who killed their wives. A man who killed an adulterous wife might receive a relatively light sentence or even be pardoned entirely on the grounds that he was defending family honor. A woman who killed an abusive husband, however, was challenging the natural order of male authority and could expect the harshest possible punishment, regardless of the circumstances that drove her to violence. The interrogation of female suspects also took on distinctive characteristics. Women were sometimes questioned by female court officials, not out of modesty concerns, but because it was believed that women might be more effective at extracting confessions from other women. These female interrogators, often former criminals themselves, who had earned their positions through cooperation with authorities, understood the particular pressures and vulnerabilities that could be exploited during questioning. Torture of women followed different protocols as well. Certain types of physical punishment were considered inappropriate for women, not because they were too cruel, but because they might damage a woman's reproductive capacity or violate sexual taboos. Instead, women faced psychological torture designed to exploit their supposed emotional weakness and their attachment to family relationships. Threatening to arrest their children or harm their parents was often more effective than physical pain. The system of collective punishment took on special meaning for women as well. A woman's crime could bring shame on her entire extended family, affecting marriage prospects for sisters and daughters, and potentially destroying the social standing of multiple generations. This created enormous pressure on families to closely supervise their female members and intervene quickly when problems arose. But women weren't just passive victims of this system. They learned to navigate and sometimes manipulate its contradictions. Some women used their legally recognized weakness to avoid responsibility for crimes they had clearly committed. Others exploited the system's emphasis on family honor to negotiate more favorable treatment by emphasizing their roles as mothers or daughters-in-law. The most successful female criminals were often those who understood how to present themselves as victims of male influence or circumstance, regardless of their actual level of responsibility. Court records show women delivering elaborate confessions that portrayed them as naive innocents led astray by evil men, even in cases where the evidence suggested they were the primary instigators of complex criminal schemes. This gendered approach to justice created a legal landscape where women's punishments were simultaneously more lenient and more personally devastating than men's. A woman might avoid execution only to face social death, exile from family, destruction of marriage prospects, and complete erasure from respectable society. In a culture where women's identity was almost entirely defined through family relationships. This social punishment could be more cruel than death. All those carefully calibrated punishments we've been discussing weren't meant to happen in dark corners or behind closed doors. Oh no, Joseon justice was fundamentally a public affair, designed as much for the education of the watching crowd as for the correction of the criminal. The streets, markets, and town squares of Korea became stages for elaborate morality plays, where real suffering served as entertainment, education, and social control, all rolled into one horrifying spectacle. The public nature of punishment served multiple purposes that reveal the sophisticated thinking behind what might seem like simple sadism. First, it provided deterrence. Nothing discouraged potential criminals quite like watching someone else receive 50 lashes in the town square. Second, it reinforced social hierarchies by demonstrating the consequences of stepping out of line. And third, it allowed the community to participate in the justice process, creating a sense of collective responsibility for maintaining order. The most common form of public punishment was the street beating, administered right there in the marketplace, where maximum numbers of people could witness the consequences of criminal behavior. The condemned person would be tied to a wooden post or forced to lie on the ground, while an official administered the prescribed number of blows with mathematical precision. Court records show that these beatings were timed to coincide with market days, ensuring the largest possible audience for the educational display. But the real genius of public punishment lay in the theatrical elements that surrounded the actual physical suffering. Before the beating began, a court official would read aloud the charges and the criminal's confession, often with elaborate moral commentary about the dangers of straying from the righteous path. The criminal might be forced to repeat their confession publicly, describing not just what they had done, but expressing remorse and gratitude for the court's merciful correction. The wooden pillory, or gonga, represented perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated form of public punishment. The criminal's head and hands were locked into wooden boards, forcing them to stand in uncomfortable positions for hours or days, while passers-by could observe their shame. What made this particularly cruel was the way it transformed the criminal into a living exhibition, a cautionary tale that people could examine at their leisure. The pillory wasn't just about physical discomfort. It was about the complete destruction of human dignity. People locked in the stocks couldn't eat, drink, or relieve themselves without public assistance and humiliation. They became dependent on the mercy of strangers for basic survival, often the same community members they had wronged through their crimes. Some kind souls would offer water or food, others would throw refuse or hurl insults. The criminal never knew which they'd receive. Location mattered enormously in these public displays. Punishments weren't randomly placed around town. They were carefully positioned for maximum impact. The busiest market intersections, the entrances to temples, the areas around government buildings, these were the prime real estate of public shame. Some locations became so associated with punishment that they developed their own grim folklore, with locals sharing stories of the most memorable criminals who had suffered there. The seasonal timing of public punishments also reveals the careful thought behind these displays. Major punishments were often scheduled around festivals and market days, when crowds would be largest. Spring executions coincided with planting season, serving as reminders of the social order that needed to be maintained for agricultural success. Autumn punishments came with harvest celebrations, reinforcing the connection between social compliance and community prosperity. What's particularly fascinating is how public punishment created a form of involuntary theater where the audience became part of the performance. Watching public punishment wasn't optional. When a beating or execution was scheduled in your neighborhood, social pressure essentially required your attendance. Failing to appear could be interpreted as lack of proper civic engagement or even sympathy for the criminal. The crowd's reaction was carefully monitored by officials who understood that public punishment was only effective if it produced the right emotional response. Expressions of inappropriate sympathy for the criminal, excessive enjoyment of their suffering, or disrespectful behavior during the proceedings could result in the observers facing their own legal consequences. The audience was expected to display proper moral reactions, sober attention, appropriate horror at the criminal's fate, and visible satisfaction with the justice being administered. Children were specifically encouraged to attend these displays as part of their moral education. Parents would bring young ones to witness punishments, using the spectacle as a teaching moment about the consequences of bad behavior. Imagine being 6 years old and watching your neighbor receive a public beating while your father explains exactly which of your own misbehaviors might lead to similar consequences. It was childhood trauma systematically deployed as social control. The criminals themselves were expected to play their assigned roles in these public dramas. They were supposed to express appropriate remorse, thank the authorities for their merciful correction, and use their suffering as an opportunity to warn others against following their path. Those who maintained their innocence, showed defiance, or failed to display proper gratitude could face additional punishment for their poor attitude. Some criminals became inadvertent celebrities through their public punishments, remembered for years afterward for particularly dramatic confessions or memorable final words. Others tried to use their moment of public attention to proclaim their innocence or reveal corruption in the justice system, though this rarely ended well for them. The smart ones played their parts convincingly, understanding that cooperation might mean the difference between a relatively quick punishment and a prolonged ordeal. The aftermath of public punishment was almost as important as the event itself. The condemned person had to continue living in the same community that had witnessed their humiliation, creating lasting social consequences that extended far beyond the physical suffering. Former criminals became permanent examples, their past punishments serving as ongoing reminders to their neighbors about the price of transgression. This system created a culture where everyone was simultaneously enforcer and potential victim of social control. Your neighbors were your judges, your community was your courtroom, and your daily life was conducted under the watchful eyes of people who had witnessed the consequences of stepping out of line. It was democracy of a sort, a participatory justice system where everyone had a role to play in maintaining order through collective surveillance and shared responsibility for punishment. The psychological effects of this public shame culture extended far beyond the immediate participants. Living in a society where your humiliation could become community entertainment created a climate of constant self-monitoring and social anxiety that shaped behavior in profound ways. People became expert at reading social cues, managing their public image, and avoiding any action that might provide grounds for future public embarrassment. While those public spectacles of punishment provided dramatic moments that punctuated community life, the real grinding horror of Joseon justice played out in the kingdom's prisons, cramped, disease-ridden spaces where the accused waited months or years for their cases to be resolved. If you thought the courtroom interrogations were bad, prison life was where the justice system revealed its capacity for casual, everyday cruelty that made those theatrical public punishments look almost merciful by comparison. Joseon prisons weren't designed for long-term incarceration in the modern sense. They were holding pens for people awaiting trial, sentencing, or execution. This might sound like a minor distinction, but it had profound implications for how these institutions operated. Since prisoners weren't supposed to be there permanently, there was little incentive to make the facilities habitable or even survivable. They were temporary storage for human problems, and the conditions reflected that grim utilitarianism. The typical county prison was a single large room or a series of small cells packed far beyond their intended capacity. Imagine a space designed to hold 20 people cramming in 60 or 80 prisoners, all sharing the same fetid air, limited sanitation facilities, and whatever food the authorities bothered to provide. Privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. You ate, slept, relieved yourself, and waited for justice in full view of dozens of other desperate people. The social dynamics inside these overcrowded spaces created their own form of justice that often had little to do with the legal system outside. Stronger prisoners dominated weaker ones, forming hierarchies based on physical power, outside connections, and the nature of their alleged crimes. Political prisoners and nobles maintained higher status even in prison, while common criminals and social outcasts found themselves at the bottom of the prison pecking order. Food was the primary currency of prison life, and it was always scarce. The government provided minimal rations, usually just enough rice or barley to keep prisoners alive, supplemented occasionally with kimchi or other pickled vegetables. Families were expected to provide additional food for their imprisoned relatives, creating a system where your survival depended on maintaining outside relationships and having relatives who could afford to keep you fed. This created some heartbreaking dynamics. Poor families would sometimes bankrupt themselves trying to keep imprisoned relatives alive, selling land, tools, and household goods to buy food for the prison. Wealthy families could ensure their members ate well even in jail, sometimes bringing elaborate meals that highlighted the class distinctions that followed prisoners even into confinement. And prisoners without family connections simply went hungry, growing weaker and more desperate as their cases dragged on. The seasonal nature of Korean weather made prison conditions even more brutal. Summer brought stifling heat to overcrowded spaces with little ventilation, creating perfect conditions for disease to spread rapidly through the prisoner population. Winter meant inadequate heating in buildings designed more for security than habitability, with prisoners huddling together for warmth while trying to avoid the various infections that flourished in the cold, damp conditions. Disease was the great equalizer in Joseon prisons. Typhus, dysentery, and various respiratory infections spread without regard for social status or the nature of your alleged crimes. Many prisoners died of illness before their cases were ever resolved, which the authorities treated as a form of divine justice. If you died in prison, it was obviously because heaven had decided your guilt. This convenient theology relieved officials of any responsibility for the deplorable conditions they maintained. The psychological toll of prison life was as devastating as the physical conditions. Prisoners had no reliable information about when their cases might be resolved, creating a form of temporal torture where hope and despair alternated without pattern. Some waited weeks, others waited years. The uncertainty was maddening, made worse by a legal system that operated according to bureaucratic rhythms that had little relationship to human suffering. Communication with the outside world was severely restricted and entirely dependent on the goodwill of guards who could be bribed, threatened, or simply ignored prisoners' requests for contact with family members. Some prisoners lost touch entirely with their outside lives, watching their businesses collapse, their families disperse, and their social connections wither while they sat in legal limbo. The guards themselves were often drawn from the same social classes as the prisoners, creating complex relationships that could shift between sympathy and exploitation depending on circumstances. A guard might show mercy to a prisoner who reminded him of his own family situation, or he might take out his frustrations about his low-status job on inmates who couldn't fight back. The arbitrary nature of guard behavior added another layer of unpredictability to an already chaotic environment. Escape was theoretically possible, but practically suicidal. The physical security of most prisons was actually quite minimal, often just wooden walls and simple locks that could be overcome with sufficient determination. But escaping from prison was itself a serious crime that would add years to any eventual sentence, and escaped prisoners became fugitives in a society where strangers were automatically suspect and everyone knew their neighbor's business. More importantly, successful escape required somewhere to go and someone willing to help you, which was nearly impossible in Joseon's tightly knit communities. An escaped prisoner couldn't return home, couldn't approach family members, and couldn't engage in normal economic activity without immediately drawing attention. Most escape attempts ended with recapture within days, followed by severe additional punishment that made the original charges seem trivial. The prison experience created its own form of education about the realities of Joseon society. Prisoners learned firsthand about corruption, arbitrary authority, and the gap between legal theory and actual practice. They witnessed how money and connections could improve conditions even in the worst circumstances, and how powerlessness made people vulnerable to every kind of exploitation and abuse. Some prisoners emerged from their confinement with a sophisticated understanding of how the system actually worked, which sometimes served them well in their post-prison lives. Others were broken by the experience, psychologically damaged in ways that made successful reintegration into society nearly impossible. The prison system created its own category of social outcasts, people who had been marked by extended exposure to the criminal justice system and who carried that stigma for the rest of their lives. Perhaps most cruelly, the uncertainties of prison life meant that some people suffered more from the process of justice than they would have from swift punishment. A prisoner who spent 2 years in horrible conditions, waiting for trial, might eventually receive a sentence of 6 months' exile, meaning they had already served 4 times their actual punishment before their case was even resolved. The system's inefficiencies became an additional form of torture that no one had officially ordered, but everyone accepted as the natural consequence of seeking justice. After enduring the horrors of prison life we just explored, some prisoners faced the ultimate expression of Joseon justice, execution. But even death in this meticulously organized society couldn't be simple or straightforward. Executions were elaborate ceremonies that combined legal procedure, religious ritual, and public theater into events that could take days to unfold properly. If you were going to die for your crimes, the state wanted to make sure everyone learned the appropriate lessons from your departure. The journey to execution began long before the actual moment of death, with a complex bureaucratic process that revealed the Korean genius for turning even the most final acts into exercises in administrative thoroughness. Death sentences required multiple levels of approval, starting with the local magistrate who conducted the trial, moving up through provincial governors, and ultimately requiring confirmation from the king himself for the most serious cases. This wasn't just bureaucratic inefficiency. It was a deliberate system of checks and balances designed to prevent hasty executions, while also creating maximum drama around the death penalty. The condemned person and their family could submit appeals at multiple levels, sometimes delaying execution for months or even years. During this period, the prisoner lived in a peculiar state of suspended animation, knowing their fate was sealed, but uncertain when it would be carried out. The actual methods of execution were carefully matched to both the severity of the crime and the social status of the condemned. Strangulation was considered the most merciful option, typically reserved for nobles or those whose crimes, while serious, hadn't completely destroyed their family honor. The condemned person would be seated, and a silk cord placed around their neck, with death coming relatively quickly and without the dramatic violence of other methods. Beheading was the standard execution method for most serious criminals, carried out with a heavy sword, wielded by an official executioner who held a position that was both essential and deeply stigmatized. These executioners were skilled professionals who took pride in their ability to accomplish death with a single clean stroke, but their occupation made them social outcasts who lived apart from normal community life. It was honest work that no one wanted to acknowledge knowing about. For the most heinous crimes, treason, parricide, or offenses that shocked the moral sensibilities of the era, there were more elaborate execution methods designed to serve as maximum deterrents. These could involve prolonged procedures that maximized suffering while ensuring the condemned person remained conscious long enough to contemplate their fate. The details were gruesome enough that even medieval Koreans found them disturbing, which was precisely the point. The timing of executions followed seasonal patterns that reflected deep beliefs about cosmic harmony and social order. Most executions were carried out in autumn, after the harvest was complete and before the harsh winter set in. This timing wasn't accidental, it aligned with the natural cycle of death and renewal, suggesting that human justice should follow the same patterns as the natural world. Spring executions were rare and reserved for the most urgent cases, usually involving crimes that posed immediate threats to social stability. Summer executions were avoided when possible, partly because of practical concerns about heat and disease, but also because summer was associated with growth and life, making it inauspicious for death rituals. Winter executions were sometimes used for political prisoners, creating a symbolic connection between their crimes and the frozen, lifeless season. The location of executions was as carefully chosen as their timing. Most took place at designated execution grounds outside the city walls, in areas that were easily accessible to large crowds, but removed from the daily life of the community. These execution grounds developed their own grim atmosphere over time, becoming places associated with death and moral instruction, where people came to witness the ultimate consequences of criminal behavior. But some executions were deliberately held in more central locations when the authorities wanted to maximize their impact. A corrupt official might be executed in front of the government building where he had worked, creating a powerful message about the consequences of abusing public trust. A merchant who had cheated customers might face death in the marketplace where he had conducted his fraudulent business, turning the scene of his crimes into the stage for his punishment. The condemned person's family played a complex role in these execution rituals. They were expected to attend and witness the death of their relative, but their behavior during the execution was carefully scrutinized for signs of appropriate shame and acceptance of the court's judgment. Excessive grief could be interpreted as criticism of the justice system, while insufficient sorrow might suggest the family didn't properly understand the gravity of their relative's crimes. Some families tried to negotiate for the return of the body after execution, particularly if the condemned person was a family patriarch whose proper burial was essential for ancestral rituals. These negotiations could become elaborate affairs involving bribes, petitions, and demonstrations of the family's continued loyalty to the state despite their relatives' crimes. Success wasn't guaranteed. Some bodies were deliberately left unburied as additional punishment for the most serious offenses. The actual moment of execution was surrounded by ritual that served multiple purposes. The condemned person was expected to make a final statement that acknowledged their guilt, expressed remorse for their crimes, and warned others against following their path. These weren't spontaneous confessions. They were carefully scripted performances that reinforced the moral lessons the authorities wanted the watching crowd to absorb. Court officials would read formal announcements detailing the condemned person's crimes and the legal reasoning behind their sentence. Religious figures might offer final prayers or moral instruction. The entire proceeding was designed to transform individual death into collective moral education, making each execution a sermon delivered through the ultimate form of visual aid. The crowd's behavior during executions was as important as the official ceremony itself. spectators were expected to display appropriate moral reactions, horror at the crimes, satisfaction with the justice being administered, and renewed commitment to lawful behavior. Officials monitored the crowd for signs of inappropriate sympathy for the condemned or excessive enjoyment of the spectacle, either of which could result in the observers facing their own legal consequences. Children were specifically brought to witness executions as part of their moral education, creating shared memories that would shape their understanding of justice and social order for the rest of their lives. Imagine the psychological impact of watching your first execution as a young child, seeing the ultimate consequences of stepping outside social boundaries, while your parents explained exactly how the condemned person's choices had led to this moment. The aftermath of execution involved careful disposal of the body and ritual cleansing of the execution site. The goal was to complete the process of justice while avoiding any lingering spiritual contamination that might affect the community. Some execution grounds required periodic purification ceremonies to neutralize the accumulated spiritual effects of multiple deaths. Perhaps most tellingly, the elaborate nature of execution rituals revealed the deep anxiety underlying Joseon society's approach to justice. The need for such complex ceremonies, multiple approvals, and careful timing suggested a culture that was simultaneously confident in its moral authority and deeply worried about the consequences of taking human life, even in the name of justice. By the 19th century, even the most tradition-bound Korean officials were beginning to recognize that their elaborate system of punishment, with its torture devices, public humiliations, and ceremonial executions, was starting to look distinctly medieval compared to what was happening in the wider world. The arrival of Western ideas about justice, human rights, and legal procedure created pressure for reform that would challenge 5 centuries of established practice, though change came slowly and often met fierce resistance from those who saw traditional punishment as essential to social order. The first serious reform attempts came during the reign of King Jeonjo in the late 18th century, a ruler who was genuinely troubled by the brutality of the existing system and worried about its effects on both criminals and society. Jeonjo initiated reviews of harsh sentences, established procedures for appealing death penalties, and most remarkably, began questioning whether torture was really necessary for extracting truthful confessions. These weren't revolutionary changes, but they represented the first cracks in a system that had previously been considered as unchangeable as the mountains. What's fascinating about these early reforms is how they revealed the deep philosophical tensions within Joseon society itself. Progressive officials argued that excessive punishment actually corrupted social morality by making people callous to suffering, while conservatives countered that any weakening of traditional discipline would lead to social chaos. The debates were intense and often personal, with reformers accused of being soft on crime and traditionalists dismissed as bloodthirsty relics. The most significant change came with the gradual elimination of the most brutal torture techniques. The wooden compression devices, suspension torture, and forced water consumption were quietly phased out of official use, though they lingered in some remote areas where old habits died hard. This wasn't necessarily because Korean officials had developed sudden concern for prisoner welfare. It was partly because they were starting to recognize that confessions extracted through extreme torture weren't particularly reliable. Prison conditions also began to improve, though the changes were glacial and uneven. Some facilities were expanded to reduce overcrowding. Basic medical care was introduced in major cities, and families gained more reliable access to imprisoned relatives. These improvements were often driven by practical concerns rather than humanitarian impulses. Sick and dying prisoners were expensive to maintain and created public health hazards that affected entire communities. The role of social class in determining punishment became more controversial as Korean society slowly began to absorb Western ideas about equality before the law. While the old hierarchical system never completely disappeared, there were efforts to standardize punishments across class lines and reduce the most egregious examples of differential justice. A yongbin who committed fraud might still receive better treatment than a commoner, but the gap was narrowing somewhat. Women's punishments also evolved, though here the changes were particularly complex because they intersected with broader debates about gender roles and family structure. Some of the most degrading gender-specific punishments were quietly eliminated, while others were retained under the argument that they were necessary for maintaining family stability. The crime of excessive jealousy disappeared from legal codes, but adultery remained a serious offense with severe consequences. The public spectacle aspect of punishment faced increasing criticism from reform-minded officials who argued that these displays brutalized spectators and turned justice into entertainment. Some cities moved their executions to less public locations and reduced the theatrical elements surrounding punishment, though this met resistance from those who believed public deterrence was essential for crime prevention. Perhaps most significantly, the entire philosophical foundation of Joseon punishment began to shift from moral reformation to practical deterrence. The old Confucian ideal of transforming criminals through suffering gave way to more pragmatic concerns about preventing crime and protecting society. This sounds like a small change, but it represented a fundamental transformation in how Korean society understood the purpose and limits of legal punishment. The influence of Western legal ideas accelerated these changes in the late 19th century as Korea was forced to open its borders and engage with foreign legal systems. Treaties with Western powers included provisions that protected foreign nationals from traditional Korean punishments, creating a two-tier justice system that highlighted the perceived backwardness of local practices. Korean officials found themselves in the embarrassing position of having to explain why their own people deserved treatment that they wouldn't inflict on foreigners. The Japanese colonial period brought an abrupt end to traditional Joseon punishment practices, though not necessarily for humanitarian reasons. The Japanese imposed their own legal system, partly to demonstrate their civilizational superiority, and partly to create more efficient mechanisms of social control. Traditional Korean punishments were replaced with modern prison systems, standardized legal procedures, and execution methods that were considered more scientific and humane. But here's the remarkable thing about the legacy of Joseon punishment. Many of its underlying assumptions about justice, social order, and collective responsibility survived the transition to modernity and continue to influence Korean society today. The emphasis on confession and remorse, the importance of public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and the belief that punishment should serve broader social purposes all echo through contemporary Korean criminal justice. Modern South Korea's approach to criminal justice retains distinctly Korean characteristics that can be traced back to Joseon principles. The emphasis on rehabilitation over pure punishment, the importance of family and community support for offenders, and the expectation that criminals should demonstrate genuine remorse, all reflect continuities with traditional practices, even though the actual methods have changed completely. The Korean concept of Han, a complex emotional state involving grief, regret, and acceptance of suffering, shapes how both criminals and victims approach the justice process in ways that would be familiar to Joseon-era observers. The modern emphasis on restorative justice and victim-offender mediation reflects traditional Korean beliefs about the importance of repairing social relationships damaged by crime. Even the contemporary Korean media's fascination with crime and punishment can be seen as an evolution of the public spectacle aspect of traditional justice. Television dramas about prosecutors and judges, true crime documentaries, and public interest in high-profile criminal cases all serve similar functions to those old marketplace executions. They reinforce social values and provide moral education through the examination of criminal behavior and its consequences. The class-based aspects of traditional justice have largely disappeared from formal legal structures, but informal networks of influence and social connection still affect how justice is experienced in practice. Wealthy defendants still have access to better legal representation and more favorable treatment, though the mechanisms are more subtle and the disparities less extreme than in Joseon times. Perhaps most intriguingly, the Korean emphasis on collective responsibility for individual behavior persists in modified forms. Families still feel shame for relatives' criminal behavior. Communities still mobilize to support or ostracize members based on their legal troubles. And there's still a strong belief that social harmony requires everyone to take responsibility for maintaining order. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider how those medieval Korean magistrates with their bamboo canes and wooden pillories were grappling with the same fundamental questions about justice that we still struggle with today. How do we balance punishment with mercy? How do we deter crime while preserving human dignity? How do we satisfy victims' need for justice while maintaining hope for offenders' redemption? The tools have changed, but the underlying tensions remain as complex and unresolved as ever. The Joseon approach to punishment may seem brutal and alien to modern sensibilities, but it emerged from genuine attempts to create a just society that balanced individual accountability with collective welfare. The reformers who gradually transformed that system were motivated by similar impulses, the desire to reduce unnecessary suffering while maintaining social order and moral standards. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about Joseon punishment was not its cruelty, but its ambition, the belief that legal systems could actually transform human behavior and create more virtuous societies. Whether that faith was justified is a question each generation must answer for itself. But the Korean experience suggests that the search for perfect justice is both eternally necessary and perpetually unfinished. The distant echoes of those courthouse drums and executioners' swords remind us that every legal system reflects the values, fears, and hopes of the society that creates it. As Korea continues to evolve its approach to justice in the 21st century, it carries forward both the wisdom and the warnings embedded in 5 centuries of traditional practice, a complex inheritance that continues to shape how Koreans understand the relationship between individual responsibility and collective welfare. And with that thought, let yourself sink deeper into the comfortable darkness of your bed, knowing that the worst punishment you're likely to face for any of your minor transgressions is probably just a parking ticket or a strongly worded email. The bamboo canes have been retired, the wooden pillories have been relegated to museums, and justice has found gentler, if perhaps less dramatic, ways to remind us all of our obligations to each other and to the societies we share. Sleep well and be grateful for the boring, bureaucratic, and mercifully mundane nature of modern legal systems that process our conflicts with forms and filing fees rather than public beatings and ceremonial executions. Sometimes progress really is as simple as trading spectacle for paperwork, and perhaps that's not such a terrible bargain after all. The stories we've traced tonight, from those first philosophical foundations through centuries of systematic suffering to the gradual recognition that perhaps there were gentler ways to maintain social order, remind us that justice is never a finished project, never a completed system, but always a work in progress, shaped by each generation's understanding of what we owe each other. Those Joseon magistrates sitting in their elevated courtrooms, carefully measuring out precise numbers of cane strokes, according to ancient legal formulas, believed they were creating perfect justice through perfect precision. The families watching their relatives suffer public punishment thought they were witnessing necessary moral education. Even the prisoners enduring months of uncertainty in overcrowded cells were part of a system that claimed to serve higher purposes than simple revenge. Were they wrong? Were they right? The question dissolves into the larger mystery of how any society decides what constitutes fair treatment of those who break its rules. The Korean experience suggests that every answer creates new problems, every solution reveals unexpected consequences, and every generation must find its own balance between justice and mercy. As you let these images fade, the courthouse ceremonies, the marketplace beatings, the elaborate execution rituals, allow yourself to appreciate the long, slow, often painful process by which societies learn to treat each other with greater kindness. The arc of justice may bend toward mercy, but it bends slowly, and only through the accumulated efforts of countless individuals who decided that there must be better ways to solve human problems than the methods they inherited. Let that thought carry you gently into sleep, grateful for progress measured not in dramatic gestures, but in quiet improvements to the ordinary machinery of human cooperation.